Your love is lifting me. 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 Your love is lifting me higher, 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 higher.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, Mr. Minner. Yes. I hope that some of you who don't usually stand up to dance are standing up to dance. Because I have really one question for you this morning. And that question is, do you know who you are? I like that. Working on it. That's a good answer. Most of us, I don't know how you introduce yourselves to each other, but most of us answer yes to that question. I know who I am. My name is Barbara Prose. I'm a minister, a wife, a mother, an aunt. I'm from New England. I'm white, well-educated. I was a midwife. I've been waiting all my life to be part of the revolution. The revolution Jesus preached about, a revolution in values. You each have your own versions of who you are, your own bio, your own beginnings, your own middles. No endings yet, because you're all still here with us. Do you know who you are, though? We each have our own clusters of communities to which we belong, including this cluster of 50 states we call our country. I'm an American. Probably most of you can say, even though I know we have a guest from France here this morning, you can say bonjour. That's good. You can practice our languages. We're part of this cluster of people we call all souls. So a lot of us would say, I'm an inclusionist. I'm a universalist. You want to say that? Yes. I'm an inclusionist. Great. I'm a universalist. Excellent. We may have ties still, though, to other churches and other religious homes and organizations. We might still call this place home, as our youth said earlier. So we may say things like, I meditate, I fast, I commune with God in nature, I pray, I praise. We all have different ways of expressing our innate spirituality. You may also identify with a certain political party, or in this season, you may be choosing not to identify with any particular political party. You may support the ACLU or the NAACP or the Nature Conservancy. There are all these organizations that we belong to, we contribute money to, that help us know who we are. You may even, I know I do, tune your radio, I bet Mr. Minner does, to specific stations that match your moods on any given day or even just any particular moment. Yes, I know who I am, you're likely to say. If somebody asks you, I like spicy foods and gin. I don't like beer. I love to dance. Music soothes my mortal soul. We think we know the answer, but then circumstances change, and we're changed by what's happening around us and to us. There's so many examples, but the person my heart has been on this week has been Joseph. Joseph from the book of Genesis, in the book of beginnings. And when we meet him, if you remember the story of Joseph, we're all taught the story of Joseph, most of us, especially if you're raised in Oklahoma, I think. We meet him when he's 17, and he's clearly his father's favorite. He's confident and he's carefree, but his brothers are driven mad with jealousy. Mr. Minner was talking about jealousy and how close jealousy is to hate in his songs, and so they plot to kill their brother until one of them feels a little bit of remorse and persuades the others to sell their brother into slavery instead of killing him. So who is Joseph? Favored son or outcast? Victim of lies and betrayals, or victor over untruths and injustices? Joseph is both. Who Joseph was changed, just as who we are changes. We often discover more of who we are, like Joseph, because of the hardships and the losses, the disappointments, the betrayals, and the failures, even the failures we endure. We discover that our identities aren't as fixed as we thought they were, and that depending on what's going on around us, different parts of us matter more or less. In Egypt, Joseph became more than Israelite. That's where he was from. In Egypt, he became an Egyptian, even an Egyptian ruler. And he never stopped being what he was at the very beginning, a simple shepherd, a brother, and his father's favorite. And so I ask again, who are you? And what role is God asking you to play in this season of your life, in your family's life, in this church's life, and in this city's life? Because we are not called to remain the same. We are not called to have a fixed identity and stay true to that no matter what. We are called to adapt. I'm sure many of you have thought you knew who you were at one point in your life, and then everything changed. Yes. And the old sense of yourself just evaporated. It was gone. Maybe you were married. You discovered your spouse was leading a double life, and you end up single, a single parent, on your own again. Maybe you were married and discovered you were gay and chose to start over again, a whole new life, maybe even losing your family, becoming a new person. Maybe you've been healthy all your life, and now you find yourself suddenly struggling with a serious illness and discover whole new parts of your personality emerging. Were you once very successful and suddenly experienced unexpected failures, changing your life radically? Or maybe you never achieved the success you hoped for, formed an identity around that as a loser, but suddenly your life is starting to take off, making you wonder, who am I really? A failure? A success? Who is this person emerging now? Who we are and what happens next in our lives isn't fixed or determined the way we tend to think it is. Just look around you today. We are living in very interesting times. After 8 years of having a black president, it seems that many white people are waking up to the realities of racism. And as the possibility of having our first woman president is more and more probable, not making any predictions up here in the pulpit, but as that becomes more probable, the realities of sexism seem to be surfacing. And it seems that men will be waking up to the injustices of gender. Some men may have to wake up. And I love that some men are clapping. Thank you very much. To the injustices of gender that women have always suffered, even in this country that proclaims freedom for all. As power shifts, we begin to see ourselves differently. Sexual assault is a crime. Today, if we're black, we can dream, maybe my child will be president someday. Today, if we're a parent of girls, we can dream, maybe my daughter will be president someday. That was never true before. That's only true today. As power shifts in our lives and around us, who we are, what our roles are, and even our destinies change. Different times demand new responses from us. New responses create new identities. It's striking in Joseph's story, if you remember, how his identity changes. But it's not just Joseph's story, it's my story, and it's your story, and your story too. The movement from being powerful to powerless, and then from powerless to powerful is all of our stories. Yes. It's our presidential candidates' stories right now. It's our story as a nation today. The politically powerful are revealing themselves as spiritually powerless. And the politically powerless are emerging as spiritually powerful. We all have the capacity to be spiritually powerful, no matter what our circumstances. No matter what our circumstances, it's news, and it's not news, it's the heart of the gospel. Many who are first will be last, and the last will be first. Matthew 19. It doesn't matter if we're down on our luck or riding high. Circumstances change in a minute. But no matter where we are in our lives today, God is calling us out. God is calling you out to become someone new. There are so many stories. Nelson Mandela was imprisoned for 30 years and then became the leader of his country upon release from jail, not unlike Joseph. Muhammad Ali was reviled by the press and the public and later became a revered public figure. Whoever wrote those ancient texts knew something about the way the world works and the way God works in and through us. Moses himself was a slave in Egypt. Several generations after Joseph died, the Israelites were once again enslaved by a new Pharaoh. Moses murdered a man, fled his country to save his own life, and then returned to Egypt to demand that Pharaoh let his people go. Here I quote the Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was a colleague, co-conspirator, and friend of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who said the outcome of that summit meeting, I called this sermon the first summit on race, the outcome of that summit meeting has not come to an end. He wrote in 1963, Pharaoh is still not ready to capitulate. The Exodus began, but it is far from completed. We are people still on an Exodus journey, walking day by day towards more freedom and justice for all. You could say it was easier for the children of Israel to cross the Red Sea than it is for a black man to drive through Tulsa without being stopped, arrested, or shot dead. I just did say that. So who was Moses? He certainly didn't see himself as a hero or a leader or a great liberator. But he was perfect for the job, not because he was humble, but because he was raised in Egypt. Moses had a dual identity, much like Joseph. He identified not just with the Hebrews, but also with the Egyptians. Adopted as an infant by Pharaoh's daughter, remember he was scooped out of that basket on the river? Moses was raised in the ruler's court. So when he returned to Egypt to speak truth to power, he was challenging his own grandfather. I know some of us are afraid of going home at Thanksgiving, afraid to tell our families what we really believe and what church we actually attend. But when Moses went back to Egypt, he was confronting his own grandfather, not his biological grandfather, but his cultural and his historical and his political grandfather, his protector and his relative, his relation, his kin. You see, Moses didn't just belong to one race or one tribe or one people or one country like so many of us today who are mixed race or mixed culture or mixed religion or mixed identity or mixed politically or non-binary. He belonged fully to both races, both tribes, both cultures. Much like our own President Obama, who because of his mixed identities has been a transformational leader for his 8 years in the White House, a leader of our nation shifting, God, I can only pray, shifting the center to the left and leaving the ultra-conservative evangelical right wing without a strong identity or agenda today. Do you see what I see? How we identify matters. What we do and why we do it matters. Dr. Willie Parker, who some of you have met, asked me this past week if I thought Moses killed the Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew slave because the Egyptian was blood kin, or because of his righteous indignation at the injustice he had just witnessed. Did he see a brother being abused and react in rage? Or did he see an injustice and intervene accordingly, with his intervention, unfortunately, ending in death? It makes a difference why he did it. Because if he was defending his own kin because of tribal ties and blood ties, he could have just been interested in protecting his own people and his own power. But if he intervened because he didn't want to see one man hurt another, he could have been protecting life itself for its own sake. I found my answer to Dr. Parker's question, this question of why he killed, in a part of the story I never noticed before. The day after Moses kills the Egyptian for beating up the Hebrew, Moses intervenes again when he sees two Hebrews fighting this time. This time, he has no enemy to defeat, no pride to defend, no power to protect. His impulse is simply to stop the violence, to protect life. And it was that motivation which is much more threatening to the authorities than any kind of turf war or struggle over power, that brought him to their attention as a troublemaker and that forced him to leave his country or be killed. As long as we're fighting among ourselves, we pose no threat to the powers that be. As long as we are divided, we will fall, which is why it's so important that we realize the power we each have, no matter who we are. Recognizing the power we have is not just our right, but it's our responsibility. I'm going to get a little more personal. I remember when, as a white woman, I thought my experience of discrimination as a person of Jewish identity and as a woman, I've been discriminated against on both counts, I thought that qualified me to understand the experience of racism. I couldn't see my own color. I was raised to be colorblind, and so I couldn't see that in a mixed race context, I was perceived as powerful because of the color of my skin. I had to learn that my perception of power changes as my situation changes. So I want you to do a little mental exercise with me now. If you're willing, are you willing? Yes. Okay, so that same sort of internal learning, I want to give everybody a chance to do some of that inside your own mind. So just imagine, I'm not going to make you move around, but imagine I asked you to move into two groups right now. People of color on this side and white people on that side. Okay, so you've moved in your heads. People of color on this side, white people on this side. And then I would ask you to discuss your perceptions of which group was more powerful. And based on experience, then we'd all come together and discuss. And based on experience, and people who have done these exercises with people, we would all agree that the white group is perceived to have more power. And then imagine after that, I asked you to divide by gender. And we would have the men, people who identify as men, over here, and the people who identify as women over here. And you would talk again amongst yourselves about who's identified as having more power. And then we would come back together and discuss. And again, based on history, if we're honest with each other, we would likely agree that the male group is perceived as having more power. I see some people are disagreeing with me, and I can't wait to talk to you afterwards. And then the third time we would divide into two groups based on income. And we would put the people with a higher income bracket on this side and the people with a lower income bracket on this side, and discuss in our groups who is perceived as having more power. And then we would come back together again and we would agree, most of us, that the people with a higher income are perceived as having more power. There is a lot to discuss in that exercise. You can see that some groups remain in the group that has less power, especially women of color, and that white men stay in a certain group, which is often, especially rich white men, as a person who is perceived as having more power. But my question to you this morning, if you remember, is who are you? And my point, and having you try that exercise, is to realize that it depends, that it changes on what's happening, on where we are, on who we're with. It's always changing, and we're always choosing who we affiliate with. If we really want to know who we are and how God is working in our lives and how God is calling us out to be more of who we are, we will start asking ourselves questions like this. And maybe you'll try some of these questions this week. Questions like, what power do I have in this situation? And how can I use my power in this situation? Does my skin color empower or disempower me in this situation, or at work, or at home? How about my gender or my sexual orientation? Do I have more or less power in this group because of my job, because of my income? How much do my kinship ties free me, and how much do they imprison me? When and how have I underestimated my power because I was only identifying with a certain part of myself? And when and how have I become the oppressor because I was blind to my own power? The movement from being powerful to powerless, from powerless to powerful, is inescapable in all of our lives. It's why the work we're doing here together on identity and race is holy work as we dig deeper as individuals and as a community and as a nation into the realities of racism and sexism. Many of us are wanting to know more about who we are and where we came from. And anyone can find out more about their genetic history these days. Have any of you done it? Ancestry.com, or I see a few. Yeah, I've done it. A few hands going up. Earl and Josie Goodman, longtime members, have done it recently. They've been talking about it with me. I'm pretty boring genetically, actually. I have an awful lot of European DNA, about 85%, I think. Earl told me that it felt like a really risky thing to do, this experiment with finding out who he really was. But a good thing to do. He told me he's proud he did it, he's glad he did it, and he's encouraging other people to do it too. There were some surprises, but not the kinds of surprises that this Mr. Wayne Joseph got. Have you heard of Mr. Wayne Joseph? He was in the news recently. I heard about him on NPR, but there were some articles in the paper a few years ago. Mr. Joseph is a black man born in New Orleans, raised in Louisiana. He moved to California and became the principal of a big suburban high school in Southern California. He's written extensively about race in America and about his own experiences being harassed by police, being called names, disrespected because of the color of his skin. He passed on his pride in being a black man to his family, raising his kids to embrace and be proud of their black heritage. His birth certificate lists his race and color as Negro. He's a man about my age. So when his results came back, he could hardly believe it. It said 57% Indo-European, 39% Native American, 4% East Asian, and 0% African. After a lifetime as a black man, I discovered I wasn't black at all. If I was 21 instead of 50, I'd be in therapy. Joseph said, because when you define yourself one way and then at 50, there are results that say you're something else, it does rock your whole world. There are some people who've said to me, you've got to get retested. I mean, it just can't be right. And I've said, okay, let's say I get retested and I come back 9 to 10% African, so I'm back in the club now? What actually makes us who we are? We are very dichotomous in the United States. said Mark Shriver, the DNA test co-inventor. You're either black or white. And understandably, fewer than 200 years ago, that meant life or death, basically. Who was master and who was a slave? He also said that the company gets a lot of hate mail lately from white supremacists who've heard about the test and don't like it. Turns out, they might be afraid of what they might find in their own genomes. Because 5% of European Americans exhibit some detectable level of African ancestry. That means about 1 in 20 so-called white Americans have African genes in DNA. So Hawaii, not the birthplace, but one of the places our President Obama grew up, is a great place to study race and genetics, the things I'm talking about right now. So scientists have been doing just that for decades. There's so much border crossing, so much intermarriage, so many different cultures and races mixing. The people living there are developing a lot more flexibility about how they choose to identify and who they choose to be. I think setting the future for us in a way the people of Hawaii recognize overlaps in identity and exceptions, and ethnicity is becoming untethered to biology there. Even though laws are changing as people's experience reveals that we cannot be contained or defined by our race, our culture, our class, or our upbringing. Do you hear me? We cannot be contained by our race or our culture or our class. We are more than that. We are more than that, and our biology is not our destiny. And day by day, the barriers between groups are growing more permeable, which is why some people are getting really angry and afraid. Betty Joseph, Wayne's mother, said DNA results will never change the way she identifies herself. I'm a black woman, she insists. But Wayne's children did some identity searching, saying things like, this opens up a lot of doors and forces people to look at things differently about how we classify people with regard to race. In mapping human history, genes, race, and our common origins, the author Stephen Olson writes, the logical endpoint of this perspective is a world in which people are free to choose their ethnicity regardless of their ancestry. Think about Joseph, who became a ruler in Egypt. People will no longer be who they are because of some mysterious biological essence. They will be who they choose to be because of the groups with which they choose to affiliate. We're a group of people who choose to affiliate around a value and a principle that we can love beyond belief. Spiritually, we are always more than our culturally constructed identities. Politically, we are consistently called on by God and by love to use whatever power we have to liberate ourselves and each other. Some of us were raised to become someone our parents imagined we should or could be, often some unfulfilled dream of their own. Caregivers and teachers, the media and mentors imprinted other ideals and dreams upon us, and they projected their own judgments and prejudgments, their prejudices upon us, either enlarging or limiting our vision of what we're capable of becoming. But the movement from being powerful to powerless, from being powerless to powerful, is the dynamic of the gospel. It's the heart of the gospel, and it's what's happening. It's what's happening in the world today. So as white America wakes up, and as male America wakes up, and as our lives change, often unpredictably, remember, we are the participants, sometimes the leaders in this ongoing conference on race, which began when Moses and Pharaoh argued over a people's right to freedom and their right to worship their God as they wanted to. As Heschel said, to act in the spirit of race is to sunder, to slash, to dismember the flesh of humanity. But to act in the spirit of religion is to unite what lies apart, and to remember that humanity as a whole is God's beloved child. We are in an ongoing conversation about our true natures and how we are related one to the other. I like what Earl said to me when we were talking about his DNA discoveries. He said that like Mormons, we have a desire to connect ourselves and each other all the way back to our original ancestors. Science tells us we're all descended from a few women in Africa. Humanity, science, and ecology tells us we must respect the interdependent web of existence of which we're all a part. Scripture and the history of religions teach us we are all part of one family, each a child of God, given the great gift of life with a right and responsibility only to live up to our full potential. Maya Angelou wrote it beautifully in a sentence: "You may not control all the events that happen to you, but you can decide not to be reduced by them." So I close by saying to you, in every season, no matter what the season of your life, God is calling you out. God is asking you to be all of who you are, to help us all move forward together on this journey toward freedom and justice for all. Get ready. Get ready to be more than you ever thought you might be. And ask yourself this week, are you sure you know who you are?
Wow.
We are your church, and we are proud to be your church, or at least a church that's having a positive impact on your life. I am personally blessed to be your minister, or at least a minister who you're allowing to speak into your life. I hope you'll support our ministry and share your love beyond belief by texting LOVE-BB to 41444 or go to our website. But you can just text LOVE-BB to 41444 and make your gift. It's wonderful. Thank you. Be blessed and be a blessing.